Networks, who will be sharing more of their people-led initiatives and collective action to strengthen climate justice as well as development justice. So we might have not known about the siloing that the UN and the states are doing, but it's very evident that countries are siloing processes. So if they are talking about development, we will just be speaking about development in New York. And if we want to talk about human rights, or they tell you to go to Geneva. And so if you want to talk about climate change, you will go to the COP. But for us, especially for civil society and indigenous peoples, we see this in a holistic approach, and everything is interconnected, that we cannot talk about climate justice without talking about development justice. We cannot talk about development without speaking about biodiversity, about climate change, and other processes. So for today, we will be having speakers from the Philippines, from Kenya, and from a regional CSO engagement mechanism to share their strategies and action to strengthen to strengthen the synergy between climate and development. So the objectives of our side event is first to amplify people's, especially indigenous people's, leadership in climate and SDG action, share replicable practices of collective monitoring, advocacy, and co-creation, strengthen alliances across movements, sectors, and institutions, and advocate for financing, protection, and policy coherence that respect indigenous and human rights. So we have supposed to have 5 speakers, and then one of the speakers from Guatemala was not able to join us because of some logistical issues. Now we're down to 4 speakers. And then another woman youth from Belize is not able to join us, again for logistical issues, for badge issues. So she's here in Balam, but not able to join us through the entrance. And so right now we have 3 panelists to have a dialogue, and probably this is a good opportunity to have a longer conversation about this very important synergy of climate and development. So I will already start with John Leo Algo, the National Coordinator of Action Klima Pilipinas from Philippines. So to start the first question, John Leo, as the national network of civil society organizations in the Philippines towards climate action, what actions or strategies are you taking in response to climate and development issues in the country? So I'll have a follow-up question later, but for now, that's the first question.
Yeah, thank you, Mitch. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening for our audience here at the SDG Pavilion and whoever's going to watch the recording of this a few days from now or so. So, yeah, I am J.L. Algo, National Coordinator of Action Klima Pilipinas, the Philippines' leading civil society network on climate action. And 2025, this year for the Philippines, is not just about COP30. In fact, we consider this year, 2025, as the most critical year of climate action in our nation's history, largely because a lot of our national climate plans and policies are being developed or updated in the past 11 months. And we still have 1 more month to go for this year. And all of these policies and plans are intended to contribute to sustainable development in our country. And of course, some of these development plans and climate plans are also aligned with the UNFCCC/Paris Agreement objectives. Like, of course, there's the updating of our NDC, which is still ongoing at the moment. We kind of already missed the deadline, but our government wants to ensure substance or as evidence-based and economy-wide of an approach to developing our NDC as much as possible. Also, in our country, we have the development of what would be the world's 2nd national just transition framework in recognition of the interlinkages between climate and development. And there are plenty of other examples, including, for example, development of a blue carbon action roadmap to take care of our country's mangroves, seagrasses, and other manifestations of blue carbon. So there's plenty of examples that I can mention. But as far as action thema goes, one of the constants in our advocacy work when we engage with policymakers has always been bottom-up approach, always been inclusivity. And just to give you an example on the kind of influencing our national climate policies this year that we have done as a network, I like to highlight the NDC Just Transition Framework develop advocacy that we did. So learning from the lessons from 4 years ago when our country developed our NDC, it's relatively ambitious. Our first NDC compared to the rest of the field, it's a 75% mitigation target by 2030, albeit highly conditional, of course, because our country is one of the most vulnerable. But even by the admission of our government officials at the time, there are many flaws in our NDC development at the time. And they mentioned on record that one of these, for example, is that the social dimension was not accounted for. It was mostly technical, really focused on generating figures. So that's the lesson that we want to avoid. If we really want to have the kind of climate and development targets that Filipinos, who are among the most vulnerable peoples in the world, including indigenous peoples as well, must account for. So for us in AK, what we did, we got ahead of the curve. We started doing our own nationwide consultations. So we have, of course, budgetary challenges, but we traveled all around the Philippines. We conducted several sectoral focus group discussions and consultations on both the NDC and Just Transition Framework development, because in our government's philosophy, both of those frameworks are basically two halves of the same circle. So we consulted different sectors, children and youth. We had one for those working on forestry. We went to the coldest scene in our country, Baguio, where we also got to meet with indigenous peoples. So we wanted to have as inclusive of an approach as possible. And because of what we did, we actually influenced our government to conduct non-Manila consultations. So they also went regional. So that's already an example of how we can influence national policy-making process. And at the same time, just to finish, when we checked our draft of the National Just Transition Framework, we also discovered that many of the advocacy points that we pushed for are actually integrated into the draft. And that's a tremendous development already compared to the NDC from 4 years ago. So just to give examples of what we succeeded so far in pushing for. Number one is the element of universal healthcare recognition in Just Transition Development Framework. And that's very pivotal in terms of ensuring development. I mean, SDG 3, good health and well-being, is very much integrated, not only in the NDC work, but also in the Just Transition Framework work. And we also succeeded in highlighting the adaptation aspect and the environment and ecosystems aspects. Now, that may sound basic or elementary for most of us or all of us here, because you should account for adaptation in the first place to begin with. But our government's initial approach was very mitigation-centric. And when we talk about just transition, that's not going to cut it, because otherwise we are repeating the same approach we did with our very technically driven NDC. And that cannot happen with social dimensions for the Just Transition Framework. So I think that as a network, we have made tremendous progress in the development of our national policies. But of course, there's a lot more work to be done.
Yeah, thank you so much, GL, for mentioning that. And I really like the part when you highlighted that the consultations you've made are multi-sectoral. I think Ajay can come in later about that. But just a follow-up question on that, what is really the importance of having a multi-sectoral consultations and not doing the consultations in the capital? Because that's also one of our highlights every time we go, that state initiative or state-led initiative consultations always happen in the capital. And so communities, indigenous peoples are not able to voice out their concerns. And to mind you, we are more than 7,000 islands. And so how can these rural communities join the conversation in the capital? So probably just a reflection on that.
Everyone is a stakeholder to addressing the climate crisis. And on that principle alone, everyone has the right to participate in the decision-making processes to address the climate crisis, regardless of the impacts. Of course, because there's an issue of equity and, of course, justice elements as well should be there. So that's why we really make it an effort to make sure that the mistakes from previous decision-making processes will not happen again as much as possible. Of course, it's not a perfect process. Like I said, we're not exactly the richest network in the world, so we can only do so much as well. But what we really try to do is to provide that blueprint, that template, that kickstart to ensuring that, or to show the policymakers that if we can do it, you can do it too. And we also make it a point to really focus on or align our approach with some of the calls that we really want to push for. And just to give an example of what we mean by that, our NDC right now, not because we don't have a second, it should be a third NDC, right? But so far we're only on our second NDC. But in our first NDC from 4 years ago, the forestry sector and other land use sector as well is not part of our NDC. And the justification given by our government at the time is that they want to prioritize the other sectors, economic sectors, that are already emitters. Because at the time, the forestry and other land use sector is still a net sink. But of course, we found that justification, for the lack of a better word, ridiculous, because the Philippines is not exactly thriving in terms of forest protection, conservation, and restoration. So that's why for our consultations, multi-sectoral ones, we really made sure that one of our FGDs or consultations are with those working in the forestry sector, because they are the ones that understand more than climate or energy or any other groups about what it really means to protect our forests, the value that it brings, not just for mitigation, but also for adaptation and development in general. And we are, of course, glad that we also had our partner member network in the member organization in Action Klima, Tebteba Foundation, as part of that particular consultation. So we really want to make sure it's an inclusive an approach as possible. And I believe that we have managed to also communicate effectively to our government about the need for inclusivity, because during that consultation as well, Mitch, someone from our Ministry of Environment actually served as like a speaker or a resource person. So even establishing that rapport between policymakers and non-state actors can be done, especially in a time like this in the Philippines and of course around the world as well.
Thank you so much for that. And you remind me of the famous demand and call of peoples, which is nothing about us without us, which you did, for example, you can talk about forests without including those people who are really in the forest. And questioning also the government that they are supposed to be doing that, not your network, not the coordination network. Speaking of what the government should do, I will go now to Kenya. So we have here Ms. Anne Samante from wait, let me just read the MP because I don't memorize. From the Mainyoito Pastoralist Integrated Development Organization, or MPDO, working in Kenya. So just to connect that, monitoring the obligations, human rights obligations, as well as commitments of states, which an organization or a network is doing in the Philippines, which is supposed to be done by the government. How do you do your monitoring and review, especially of these commitments and obligations of your country or of your government?
Thank you very much, Mitch. I hope I'm
Closer to the mic.
okay. Yeah, thank you very much, Mitch, and very honored to be with these panelists, and happy to see you, all of you here. So just to answer your question on the monitoring of obligations, of course it's not an easy task, because we know that our governments are very good in even having policies that look very beautiful out there, but of whose implementation is almost zero. And from the current trend right now, which is a very unfortunate scenario, there's a lot now going on even in the national policy environment, where many governments are reviewing their policies, and in the process indigenous people's benefits are eroded or they no longer exist again. A good example is Kenyan Climate Change Act of 2016 that was amended in 2023. In the process of amendment, they did away with representation of indigenous peoples in the Climate Change Council, a very high, body that has the president as the member to just talk about issues, climate change. And so, so while we have had some little gains here and there, they get eroded at some point. But back to your question on how we do the monitoring, we have been privileged to implement an Indigenous Navigator program or initiative that purely, where indigenous peoples purely collect their data for and by indigenous peoples. And this has brought about so many aspects, if I can talk about that. One of them is that there is lack of capacity for the government to understand even some of the obligations that they have signed to, which is very, very, sometimes you ask yourself, so what did you ratify, for example? They do not have capacity. And some of them do not even have capacity to understand indigenous people's worldviews. They would mix us together and call us vulnerable, give us some weird kind of names. In Kenya, we are coming up with an indigenous people's policy, and one of the struggles that we've had is on the naming, the terminology. They want to call it marginalized communities and ethnic minorities policy. And the question would be, ethnic minority can be some Europeans in our country. Marginalization can be very temporary, so you cannot refer us by marginalized communities, because come 2030 and we are no longer marginalized, then the policy is no longer serving us, despite the fact that we are the ones that have pushed for it. And at one point when we were having these discussions, the government asked us, do you want a policy or do you want the term indigenous peoples? A very, very difficult question to answer. Balancing that has not been easy. But back to the Indigenous Navigator, and with the challenge that I've just talked about when it comes to capacity for government, the Indigenous Navigator project has really opened up opportunities for communities to engage with the government. Most of the time, the point where we miss is when you approach the government and say, you are violating our rights here, and the next question will be, where is the evidence? Where was that documented? And so this particular project gave us some opportunity to do our advocacy with tangible evidence. Here is the data. The indigenous peoples have lost their land because one of the areas that we were looking into, one of the core areas, was on land. And so we had records where government, where other elites and just very serious people in our country have taken away land. And so it was a tool of accountability. And so that gave us an opportunity to really negotiate with the government, not just negotiate, just have a discussion with evidence. And that helped us to monitor even the Kenya's Community Land Act of 2016, that ideally is a tool to help secure the community land rights. But with the information that we got from during the monitoring process, it became clear that communities are actually losing land. And the security of land tenure was getting very unstable for these communities. So, so one way of doing it is just making sure that you have the data, making sure that capacity building is not one direction. Capacity building is for both our communities, because another thing we noted is that sometimes we have very good provisions out there. We went to our communities, and while we know we have the UN RIP, an internationally recognized instrument that guides our lives as indigenous peoples, but they did not know it exists. So I think it is also our responsibility for you to ask that your rights be respected and all that. As much as these instruments are out there, we must be able to build the capacities of our communities for them to push for their rights after first understanding what exactly has been provided out there. It is the only way they can benefit from that. And then the other thing that we are trying to do is create partnerships with government. I've just talked about the policy. We cannot work in isolation. Fine, we fight time and again, but I've come from my experience now, sometimes we lose out by not engaging them, by looking at each other like we are rivals. When we come to the table, have a discussion, they may not take 100% of what we are saying, but they may take 30% that matters to us so much. A gain is a gain for me. It's not equal at any point with a loss. And so, yeah, that will be my response for now. I'll come back definitely.
All right.
more.
Thank you so much for that, Anne. So before probably I go to other speakers, let me just try to follow up on the data. So you were able to monitor the obligations and commitment of states, and you were able to present these as evidences. Can you probably give us one example of a change you made through this process? Were you able to abolish a law, or any example that you may share?
Well, first of all, the monitoring informed the reason why we are able now to engage with the government and come up with an indigenous people's policy where we are at the we are at the community participation phase is because we came with data showing marginalization, over years of these communities. And one of the elements we were monitoring is the SDGs, and I'm glad we are in the SDGs pavilion. And honestly and very, very sadly, it came out clearly that if nothing changes in 2030, indigenous peoples might not be able to achieve any of the SDGs. We are only 5 years into that. Talk of education. I mean, forget about quality education. Just education without quality is not very much possible right now, especially because of the impacts of climate change. I come from a community that only rears animals. We are pastoralists. And with the climate change wiping out, with the droughts wiping out our animals, let me tell you, if my mother happens to get 20 Kenya shillings, she'll not pay for my siblings' school fees. She'll go to the shop and buy food. So what we have been able to do to respond to your question is talk to governments and show the level of marginalization and the level of underdevelopment in the indigenous people's territories. With facts, they were able to look back, especially the county government. In Kenya, we have 2 levels of government, the national and the county government. We were able to lobby the county government and even got into memorandum of understanding on how some of these basic services can be made available for indigenous peoples in our communities. And this has already started, especially after signing of the memorandum of understanding. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Anne, for giving such example, especially in the context of Kenya. And I think you really opened a lot of different worlds in your speech. Number one is the human rights obligations of states. You mentioned about ratification, that the understanding of states on what they ratified might be low, or at some point they do not know what they ratified even, or what commitments are under or obligations are under those human rights mechanisms. And another world you open is about data sovereignty and data governance, that indigenous peoples have the capacity to collect, to analyze, and monitor, and use these data as evidence to advocate for the rights of indigenous peoples. So thank you so much for that. I will go back to you in a bit. I will go first to Ajay. So Ajay Ja is the co-chair, one of the co-chairs of the Asia Pacific Regional CSO Engagement Mechanism, and he will try to summarize what APRSM is in a bit. And but my question to you, Ajay, is the role of this regional mechanisms in consolidating these kinds of issues, strategies, climate action, development action, and how do you put this forward to the spaces that APRSM are engaging at? Ajay?
Thank you so much, and very pleased to be here. I represent Asia Pacific Regional CSOs engagement mechanism. It's a platform of more than 600 organizations from all over Asia and the Pacific. It was set up in the run-up to Rio Plus 20 meeting, which happened in 2012. So for the last 13 years, we have been working on the. It started as an effort to strengthen conversations on sustainable development and sustainable development goals. But now we work on a wide spectrum of areas which intersect development, rights, and sustainability. So it's a platform of more than 600 organizations. We are organized in 17 thematic constituencies, which goes far beyond UN's 9 major groups. We have, in addition, we have aging and elderly. We have communities affected by conflict and disaster. We have communities affected by HIV and AIDS. We have people with disabilities. So it's 17 sectoral thematic constituencies and 5 sub-regional constituencies, which tries to ensure that we have representation and concerns and voices from each and every part of Asia Pacific. Asia Pacific is essentially a pro-people, pro-planet and pro-grassroots organization network, and it is essentially an anti-militarist, anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist platform. And one of the main theory of change that all of us try to believe in and practice is development justice. And development justice recognizes 5 kinds of injustices, which is structural or systemic barriers also we call it. So one is redistributive injustice, the second is economic injustice, the third is social and gender injustice, fourth is environmental injustice, and fifth is lack of accountability to the people. So, and when we remove injustices from all these injustices, that becomes our 5 transformative shift of redistributive justice, economic justice, environmental justice, social gender justice, and accountability to the people. We very strongly believe that incremental change is not going to save this planet, and we need a transformative approach and transformational change. That is why one of our slogans is shift the power, change the system. That is what we believe in. We are still working on the ideological and conceptual underpinnings of development justice and its operational dimensions. So it's still a sort of work in progress, and every year many people join this platform, and they try to understand and interpret this development justice concept in their own lived experiences and from their own perspectives. So it's a constantly evolving concept, which we are very proud of. For the last 13 years, we have been collaborating with UN, ECOSOC in New York, and also more closely with ISCAP in Bangkok. And we are sort of a CSO partner for the Asia Pacific Forum on Sustainable Development that is organized every year in Bangkok. And before that, we have a 3-day People's Forum, which not only discusses the agenda that will be talked in the Asia Pacific Forum on Sustainable Development, not only the SDGs that will be under review that year, but it cuts across a whole lot of conversation related to gender, related to human rights, related to development, related to environment, etc., etc. And to some of it, it might look like an event-based platform, but actually it is not. And we come across voices and concerns from Asia Pacific Regional CSOs engagement mechanism as at a wide variety of platforms and processes related to the UN, like United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, conventions against desertification, United Nations Environment Assembly, etc., and also the HLPFs. Many, in all the years, many participant organizations from Asia Pacific Regional CSOs engagement mechanism participate in the HLPF and provide their contributions in thematic discussions or VNR discussions. Very important to add that we are also a sort of focal point uh, for VNR in Asia Pacific countries, and we try to organize a national platform of organizations who are working on SDGs in a particular country so they can be a part of the process, even though a very small number of them might participate in the HLPF as a matter of fact, but we try to train and develop a national platform of these CSOs who develop their national CSOs statement, which is actually read in the HLPF in the VNR presentations of these countries. So these are some of the areas that we have been trying to address. Number of challenges faced. Resources are shrinking. Civic space is shrinking at all places, including the UN. Also because of UN's liquidity crisis, we know. And we face several, what do you call it, for the better word, insensitive questions also from the member states. Like Mitch mentioned in the beginning, that member states at Asia Pacific Forum on Sustainable Development don't want us to talk about human rights. They say that it's a development space, and if you have to speak on human rights, you better go to Geneva. So we try to impress and remind upon them every year that SDGs is a process which takes account of everything, you know. It takes account of human rights, it takes account of development, it takes account of environment, and there could not be a distinction between all these areas. So this is what APRSM mainly does.
Thank you so much, Ajay, for those powerful and information. And I just want to highlight on the SDGs are anchored in the human rights obligations of countries. So when the indicators and targets for the SDGs are being made, it is actually they are looking at this international human rights mechanisms as basis. They did not put this from nothing. They base it from the international human rights mechanism. So thank you for highlighting that. But before I go to other speakers again, thank you for sharing APRSM. But a question on a personal note. You mentioned earlier about the siloing. I think I asked this in one of the side events, and Joanne answered it, and you were not able to. So how do you feel about this siloing of UN as well as countries on these processes? So you've been into UNEA, you've been into COPs, you've been into high-level political forum, and as you may know, they are again siloing different processes within the SDGs. Now we have UN Water Conference, we have Oceans Conference, so they are putting this in different arenas. So probably a reflection on that.
No, some kind of differentiation is important to deeply explore an SDG or a topic. And UN Ocean Conference, in that sense, serves a better purpose. I mean, HLPF, you have a 2-hour thematic discussion, and that is not sufficient to explore all the dimensions and angles of a particular issue or a particular SDG. So in that sense, I think it's okay. But talking about siloed nature of climate, biodiversity, desertification, SDGs, justified in the sense, to some extent, in the sense that you need to have a specialized team address and deal with these issues. But it goes far beyond that. If you look at national levels also, they have a separate team for climate and SDGs. We understand that you need to put specialized people at those places who understand the issues. But many times we feel that these silos are created more because it comes in a top-down approach rather than in a bottoms-up approach. If you look at the communities, they SDG, environment, climate, desertification, these issues are interlinked and interconnected. So SDGs try to interlink these issues to some extent, but then again their reliance is more on the specific processes. For example, on climate, SDG will not talk about anything. It will completely depend on the outcomes that come from UNFCCC COPs. No? So in that sense, it is silo. And these structures from the top to the down replicate these silos. Even at the block level, you will see that somebody else is responsible for SDGs and somebody else is responsible for climate. There is a forest department which is responsible for forest, but that has not served a good purpose for the people, I would say.
Thank you so much for that,
I
Ajay.
also just
Sure.
wanted to add two substantive point, if there is time later.
Okay. I will go back to you on that. So before I open the floor for questions and reflections, I'll just go back to two of our country speakers. But before that, because you mentioned about Oceans Conference, one of our speakers supposed to be here will talk about ocean conservation in Belize and the reflection of indigenous peoples in the recently concluded UN Ocean Conference. So, but she was not able to, but I'm just trying to share that probably one of the positions of the IPMG in the Ocean Conference is the support for a call for a moratorium on deep sea mining. So I'm just putting that into the table and conversation. So I'll go back to both of the country speakers from the Philippines, again, as the leading network of civil society organizations in the Philippines working on climate action. Probably a reflection on and strategy on how we can capacitate both the people and the government about the synergy of climate and development. That we cannot talk about climate or development without talking about the other. So probably on your recommendations on this synergizing climate and development justice.
Oh boy, that's a difficult question to answer. But in terms of that particular aspect of capacity building, it really depends on the context of the country, how you can say the progress that they have achieved in climate action or sustainable development achievement, for example. So in the Philippines at the moment, what we are trying to do really more of in terms of capacity building is to start off by awareness raising and understanding. Because at the moment, in the Philippines, a lot of our countrymen are increasingly becoming affected, even more so by all sorts of climate extremes. You want to talk about typhoons, droughts, sea level rise, you name it, they've experienced it probably in just the last 2 years. We're not even talking about Super Typhoon Haiyan, that was now 12 years old this month. And they are familiar with how the impacts of climate change now are on their lives because of how frequently these storms and other climate extremes are hitting them. Because the problem now is, okay, they are familiar with the impacts, but they're not familiar so much with the indirect impacts, those long-term impacts outside of the extreme weather events. So when we talk about climate change to communities, for example, none of them is gonna care about greenhouse gas emissions or anything like that. The first thing that communities are gonna ask is, how does that affect our ability to eat 3 meals a day? How does that affect our ability to have a consistent, stable supply of potable water, or our livelihoods, or the education of our children, aka the SDGs, basically. So that is how we are trying to frame our communications to communities, even more. The government's a different approach, of course, but for communities, we really anchor it on what their concerns and interests are, because that's your starting point. And in terms of the government, in terms of the communicating on climate change, for the most part, our government agencies are more or less familiar with climate change issues. I think what is starting to lack a little bit is number one, on coordination, not just between sectors, but even within sectors. And in the government, that's what they're trying to figure out as well. Of course, there's some progress made, uh, as hard as that is to believe, but there's actually some progress in terms of intergovernmental coordination. They've set up um, this particular structure where certain agencies will focus on this, certain agencies will focus on loss and damage, on adaptation. Like, there's this very detailed structure. But of course, implementation is a different story, because no matter how well a government planned interagency coordination structure is, it still depends on a lot of other factors. The power dynamics, who gets the most budget in the national budget every year, especially on the climate side. So there are all of these factors that still must be considered. So for us, when we engage with the government, because of course, when we want, for example, though, if we want to propose, let's say, a climate solution, loss and damage, let's go to loss and damage. But the first thing the government's gonna ask is, where do we get money, right? Because that is a valid issue, whether we want to admit it or not. So what we also want, a recommendation that I will also have, is to look at existing structures. You don't have to start from scratch. And not all innovations have to be genius levels of invention. Sometimes the most innovative solutions are the most basic solutions, because a solution is only as effective as its ability to deliver benefits to those who need it the most. And the bottom line for the climate crisis is, whether it's the government that's handling it, whether it's CSOs that's doing it, the bottom line is, it's always going to be prioritization of the needs and concerns of the most vulnerable communities.
Thank you so much. It's very powerful. So from Philippines, let's move to Kenya. What can you say? So it's almost the same question. How can you? What are the steps what you are taking in capacitating communities as well as the government in the synergy of climate and development? As I think mentioned earlier, they cannot talk about climate change disaster without talking about specific SDGs. So probably the strategy in Kenya that you are doing.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think the first thing and to realize or to be aware of is that for the communities, for us to talk about development, it should be development their way. What do they mean by development? I think where one place or one point where we normally miss is when we impose the so-called development to the communities. And it's very unfortunate, because I've seen this even with donors funding putting a lot of money to something that the community will look at, and at the end of the day it becomes some white elephant project and nobody benefits. So one thing that is now away, because that is externally. So one thing is to try to make to build the capacities of the communities to be able to, of course, to prioritize their needs, to be able to put it clearly out there, including documenting some of the aspects of the elements that they are facing. And by doing that, like I talked about initially, this will help now us to have the dialogue that I talked about with the government. And so, development is something that actually indigenous people sometimes are seen as anti-development. And it is not that we are anti-development. It is because we are against the development imposed on us. So there is need for us to build our communities' capacities to be able to design. Even when we talk of co-designing, if the co-designing means we all design a project, then it means you must build the capacity of that community to be able to design then, okay? And then again, secondly, I would also say you will have to meet the needs of the community before you talk of anything. Livelihoods. They will not listen to anything. For example, I think he just talked about, you cannot bring a very good initiative or discussion if someone is hungry. They will not listen. I have had instances that you call women, for example, for a meeting, and they'll come and stay for a minute and ask, are you giving us food? And not just food for them, but are you giving us food to take home, for example? And so I think there is need to address those very, initial needs of the communities first before we talk of anything else. And when we connect this with climate, and as I said earlier, climate is driving all the challenges the communities are facing right now. Climate change, that is. The reason we are not able to achieve any of the 17 goals is because the communities have been weakened further by the climate change. And sometimes when I look at these three Rio Convention, UNFCCC, UNCCD, and UNCBD, one is leading to another and another and another. And so we cannot dare to have discussion in silos. We must come together and have discussions together, because at the end of the day, they are all affecting each other, and we do not have a particular, being intentional about not working in silos, but working together, then again, even the results of one, as much as we will integrate them in our national policies, if one looks one thing as like it's not so much of importance, then it means even if you take it to the national government, then nothing much will be of success to the communities. So again, thirdly, when you talk of capacity building for the governments, there is a gap when it comes to government, anything to do with climate. Remember, most of the government offices are highly political. So sometimes, they will bring anyone on board that don't necessarily have the skills. I've seen people be moved from one end to another, and then when you find someone that was in charge of climate change in one of the government institutions, tomorrow you find someone that doesn't completely have an idea of what is happening. And so I think there is need also to build the capacity of the government to be able to know that for some of these, like now climate being the global crisis, climate change being a global crisis, there is need that we try to make sure that whatever information that is there is also well kept in a way that when one person leaves the office, at least somebody else is able to pick up and continue. I've seen governments when you go there and you ask for something and they're like, somebody left and that information is no longer there. And so there is also need to make sure that the government understands, as I said earlier, the world views of indigenous peoples, that we are not just any other group, that we have our own special rights, that we have our own special needs, very special to us, that we cannot be handled like any other group. And so building that capacity of the government to understand indigenous people's worldviews is something that we also should put a lot of effort and energy, and also, of course, creating very good partnerships. As I said, there is need to create very, very good partnerships with the government, especially if we look at creating the synergies. We need to bring them on the table. If they are not bringing us on the table, let's bring them on our tables. Let's invite them to our communities. Let us make sure that they understand exactly from the ground, not from the capitals, what is happening to us and what are our needs, what are our priorities, what do we need, how do we need it done, and that sometimes we are not always fighting. The thing is, we just need our rights respected. We just need them to listen to us to be part of their decisions as well, us to be part of the models that are coming up, the designing the models, that we need to be part of that as well, that we need to just have some form of respect and recognition. I think I talked about in Kenya when they say there are no indigenous peoples. If you start by not recognizing, then who are you respecting then? Respect only come after you have already recognized. And so a lot needs to be done. And again, sometimes I feel like we put a lot of energy on the global spaces, but we do not put a lot of energy when it comes to making sure that whatever outcomes comes out of these spaces get into the national level, and also having indigenous people, like the NDCs he talked about. Sometimes indigenous peoples, even when countries are going for NDCs 3, they are not they're not being part of that. And then now we come to the global space and say, we have been left out. Yet at your country level, you already missed out at a very, very important point. So there is really need to try and reduce the gap between the communities and the governments.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for that, Anne. And thank you for also highlighting the Tubtubas framework that we are working on is an Indigenous people self-determined development framework. So we have around 5 minutes left. If there is any reflection or comments from the audience for a minute. Yeah, okay. And then I will go back to Ajay for his 2 points and then closing. But you have the floor, please.
I'm Brazilian. I'm from Brazilian. I know speak English, my so. I speak Spanish very good. I'm Flávio Lino. My name is Flávio Lino. I'm Secretary Executive of the Movement National Homeless People in Brazil. As big movement in Latin America, is necessary a new SDG and homeless people. Data creation is a new SDG, a global peoples in G20 block. Temos, como é que se fala? Em G20, há 6 million people homeless. And it's na preoccupation. Brazil, for 358 mil people's homeless in Brazil. As great great desigualdade. As a new SDG for homeless people, advance, big advance, and in next population. Assim, resumindo, my English as initiante, mas o que eu posso dizer é que precisamos de novo ODS para a população em situação de rua a nível global. Muito obrigado. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I'll give the question to Ajay and also your response and closing after. So a specific goal for homeless people, is it unnecessary or is it already embedded in specific ones, and how do we monitor these? And after your response, probably your closing remarks too.
Yeah, I think it's a very important issue, and but I don't know whether it will be addressed by having another separate goal. Because looking at the status of the SDGs, I believe we see in our communities, many of the communities have already given up on the SDGs. And many of us, we initially believed that it's a very politically ambitious agenda. But looking at the status, it turns out that it's a pretty ordinary agenda. No? Governments are anyways supposed to provide food, water, electricity, health services, infrastructure, clean water, clean air to people. So we have not yet seen the ambition in the SDGs being delivered. So I don't know how much having a separate goal on the homeless people will serve the purpose, but our heart goes out to homeless people. And I think it's a misnomer also. A lot of people put a lot of stress on the data and saying that what can be measured, what gets measured gets done. But in the climate space, we see that we, at least for the last 60 years, we know that GHG emissions have to be reduced to reduce the rise in temperature and prevent people from disastrous impacts of climate change. But is that happening? For the last 10 years, we know that we need to reduce GHG emissions by 57% by 2035, but the result is that we are only going to reduce emissions by 15% by 2035. Last two very important points which the title of the event reminded me, land, is about, I just wanted to share with all of you, there is a recent land gap report which says that countries who have provided NDCs have so much relied on land for carbon sequestration and neutralizing CO2 that they require more than 1 billion hectares of land. 1 billion hectare of land is more than total area of United States of America and more than 3 times area of my country, India, which is a big country, 283 million hectares. So these land will be from where will this land come? This land will come from indigenous people. This land will come from local communities. This land will come from farmers. So there is a need to be aware of that and resist that wherever you can do. I think I will stop here because time.
All right, thank you so much. And yeah, we might have extended a few minutes, but the next event is in a few minutes too. So thank you so much to our speakers and to all those audience who came in for our event today. And thank you so much for your question. And you can reach some of our speakers after the event. So thank you so much. Have a great afternoon and congratulate ourselves for finishing the first week of COP. And congratulations for us for here in Belém for 2 weeks now. Anyway, have a great afternoon and see you around. Thank you. Can I have a photo?